I was 76 years old when I discovered that being invisible could be a superpower. For 43 years, I lived in the shadow of the Widsins family farmhouse, caring for grandfather while my cousins built lives in distant cities. They stopped inviting me to reunions after I turned down too many because someone had to stay with him. I watched their Facebook photos from my kitchen window, the same spot where I'd spent decades peeling apples and mending their childhood clothes. When they visited, then grandfather died, and everything changed. The lawyer read his will in our old parlor, the same room where 5 generations of Widsins had gathered for Christmas mornings. 84 acres of Vermont farmland, the house, the bones, the maple grove, all of it mine. But what would they do when they found out their forgotten spinster aunt now owned everything they'd always assumed would be theirs? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though the beginning feels like it happened to someone else entirely. The Widsins farm sits on a gentle slope in Peachum, Vermont, where the mountains roll like sleeping giants and the seasons change with a reliability that city folks have forgotten exists. My great-great-grandfather Ezra Widsins cleared this land in 1897, built the farmhouse with his own hands, and planted the sugar maples that still tap sweet every March. Growing up here meant understanding that the land wasn't just property, it was a living thing that breathed with the seasons and held the stories of everyone who'd ever called it home. My father used to say the soil remembered every footstep, every harvest, every child who'd learned to walk between the corn rows. I believed him then, and I believe him now. The farmhouse itself tells the story of 5 generations in its bones. The original structure, built from local timber and field stone, centers around a massive fieldstone fireplace that Ezra constructed himself. Over the decades, each generation added their own touches. My great-grandfather's screen porch, my grandfather's modern kitchen in 1954, my father's workshop that still smells of sawdust and machine oil. The white pine floors creak in a familiar symphony, and every room holds the ghost of conversations that shaped our family. I was born in the upstairs bedroom that faces east, the same room where my mother grew up and where grandfather would eventually spend his final years. From that window, you can see the entire valley spread out like a patchwork quilt, our fields, the neighbor's dairy operation, the church steeple in town, and the mountains beyond that turn purple at sunset. My childhood was spent running through those fields with my cousins during summer visits, learning to drive the tractor before I was tall enough to reach the pedals properly, and sitting on grandfather Harlan's lap while he explained which crops grew best in which fields and why. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke about the land, his voice carried a reverence that I absorbed like a sponge. The family dynamics were established early and never really changed. My father, Robert, was Harlan's eldest son and the natural heir to the farming operation. My uncle Marcus had moved to Boston for business, and my Aunt Ellen had married a doctor in Burlington. During family gatherings, the adults would cluster in the living room discussing politics and local news, while we children were expected to entertain ourselves outdoors or in the basement playroom. I learned to read people by watching from the margins. Marcus always arrived late and left early, checking his watch constantly. Ellen brought elaborate gifts, but never stayed long enough to see them properly appreciated. Robert, my father, carried the weight of the farm on his shoulders and spoke little during these gatherings, content to let others fill the silence. The pattern established itself gradually. I was the quiet one, the observer, the child who helped clear dishes and set up folding chairs without being asked, while my cousins Joel, Nora, and the others spoke confidently about their school achievements and future plans. I found my voice in small acts of service. It felt natural then, this role of caretaker and helper. I told myself it was important. Work, being the one who noticed when grandfather's coffee cup was empty or when Great Aunt Millie needed help reaching the good china from the high shelves. When I turned 18, the family assumed I'd leave for college like my cousins had. Instead, I enrolled in the agricultural extension program at the University of Vermont and commuted from home. My reasoning was practical. Someone needed to help father with the farm, and I genuinely loved the work. The soil science classes fascinated me, and I discovered I had an intuitive understanding of crop rotation and sustainable farming practices that surprised my professors. But I think the real reason I stayed was simpler. This place needed me, and I needed it. In the fields and barns and the familiar rhythm of seasons, I found a purpose that the wider world never seemed to offer. While my cousins pursued careers in law and business and real estate, I was learning to read weather patterns and soil conditions, mastering the delicate balance of modern farming techniques with old-fashioned stewardship. My 20s passed quietly. I dated occasionally. There was David Brennan, who farmed over in Reigate, and later Michael O'Sullivan, who taught at the elementary school in town. But neither relationship developed into marriage, partly because I couldn't imagine leaving the farm and partly because I sensed they couldn't imagine staying. The farm required a particular kind of commitment, and I was beginning to understand that not everyone was built for that life. When father died suddenly of a heart attack at 59, I was 32 and the natural choice to care for grandfather. The family had a brief meeting in the parlor after the funeral, the same parlor where grandfather's will would eventually be read decades later. Marcus suggested selling the farm and moving grandfather to an assisted living facility in Burlington. Ellen thought a live-in nurse might be more appropriate. But grandfather himself settled the matter with characteristic brevity. Kira stays. That's the end of it. So I stay, and the years accumulated like sediment in a riverbed, layer upon layer of quiet seasons. My cousins married and had children, built careers and vacation homes, while I maintained the farm and cared for an increasingly frail old man who spoke less each year, but whose presence filled the house like smoke from the fireplace. The family reunions continued for a while, though they felt different after father died. The gatherings moved to rented venues, lake houses in New Hampshire, ski lodges in Stowe, beach houses on Cape Cod, always somewhere else, never here on the farm that had once been the center of everything. I was invited, of course, but someone had to stay with grandfather, and the excuses became easier each year. Eventually, the invitations stopped coming altogether. I learned about family milestones through Facebook posts and Christmas cards. Joel's promotion to department head, Nora's real estate development company, Tessa's social media career. They still called occasionally when they needed something help with genealogy research for a school project, contacts for local contractors when they bought a vacation place nearby, advice about selling inherited furniture. I was always helpful. Always available, always accommodating, but I was also always alone. The loneliness crept in gradually, like cold through a poorly insulated wall. During the day, I was too busy to notice there were crops to tend, equipment to maintain, endless repairs on a house that was approaching its second century. But in the evenings, after grandfather had gone to bed and the house settled into its nighttime silence, the absence of connection became as tangible as the furniture. I filled those hours reading about sustainable agriculture, learning to use the computer that Joel's son had set up for me, and maintaining detailed records of everything from rainfall amounts to crop yields to grandfather's medication schedule. The work sustained me, but it couldn't replace the human connections that had gradually eroded until I became more like a caretaker than a family member, more like hired help than someone with deep roots in this place. That's why grandfather's death hit me with such surprising force. I'd been preparing for it for years, knew his heart was failing, had discussed end-of-life care with his doctor. But when he died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March, I felt not just grief, but a profound uncertainty about who I was supposed to be now. For 43 years, my identity had been built around caring for him and maintaining this place. Without that defining purpose, I felt untethered, like a boat that had broken free from its mooring. The funeral was well attended. Family members I hadn't seen in years appeared in black clothing and subdued voices, speaking kindly about grandfather's long life and his dedication to the land. They were generous with condolences, thoughtful in their reminiscences, and careful to include me in their conversations. For a few days, I felt like part of the family again. Then came the reading of the will, and everything changed forever. The law office of Tran and Associates occupies a converted Victorian house on Main Street in St. John's Bury, where Melinda Tran has been handling the legal affairs of local farming families for 30 years. I'd met her once before, when grandfather had needed to update some property documents, and I remembered her as a sharp-eyed woman with an efficient manner and surprising warmth beneath her professional exterior. On the appointed Thursday morning, I arrived early and sat in the waiting room with its comfortable chairs and oil paintings of local landscapes. The March snow was melting in earnest now, and I could hear the sound of water running in the gutters outside. Spring was coming, and I found myself thinking about the work ahead, preparing the fields, ordering seeds, scheduling equipment maintenance. The rhythm of the farm year continued regardless of grief, and there was comfort in that predictability. Family members began arriving around 10 o'clock. Marcus came first, dressed in an expensive overcoat and checking his phone constantly. Ellen followed, accompanied by her husband, Dr. Peterson, both of them speaking in hushed tones about funeral arrangements and estate planning. Joel arrived with his wife, Sarah, and they nodded respectfully in my direction before taking seats across the room. Nora swept in wearing a black dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in a year, her blonde hair perfectly styled. Despite the emotional circumstances, she was followed by her younger brother Craig, whom I barely recognized. The gangly teenager I remembered had become a corporate lawyer with silver at his temples and an expensive watch. The last to arrive was Tessa, Marcus's granddaughter, who'd driven up from New York City for the occasion. At 27, she moved through the world with the confident energy of someone who'd never doubted her place in it. She hugged everyone enthusiastically, took several photos of the law office interior, and made comments about how quaint everything was. Melinda Tran called us into the conference room precisely at 10:30. The room was lined with law books and featured a long mahogany table where we arranged ourselves according to some invisible family hierarchy. Marcus and Ellen sat at one end, their spouses beside them. Joel and Sarah took the middle seats, while Nora, Craig, and Tessa clustered at the far end. I found myself in a chair by the window, slightly apart from the others, which felt appropriate somehow. "Thank you all for coming," Melinda began, settling her reading glasses and opening a thick folder. "As you know, we're here for the reading of Harlan Widsins' last will and testament. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this document was executed according to Vermont state law and reflects Mr. Widsins' final wishes as expressed to me during our meeting last November." She paused, and I noticed several family members shifting in their chairs. November was only 4 months ago, but grandfather had seemed reasonably healthy then. I wondered what had prompted him to update his will so close to the end. "The document is quite straightforward," Melinda continued. "After the usual legal language regarding debts and final expenses, Mr. Widsins' will contains the following primary bequest." She cleared her throat and began reading in her clear, professional voice. "To my granddaughter Kira Widsin, who has shown me the true meaning of family loyalty through her 43 years of selfless devotion to this land and to my care, I leave my entire estate. This includes the family homestead located at 847 Peacham Road, consisting of the main house, all outbuildings, farm equipment, and 84 acres of land as described in the attached survey. Also included are all bank accounts, investment portfolios, and personal property not otherwise specified. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the old radiator ticking in the corner. I stared at Melinda, certain I'd misunderstood. Something fundamental. Around the table, my relatives sat frozen, their faces registering various stages of shock and confusion. "I'm sorry," Marcus said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Could you repeat that? Did you say the entire estate goes to Kira?" "That's correct," Melinda confirmed, consulting the document again. "The will continues. I make this bequest not out of favoritism, but out of recognition. While others have built their lives elsewhere, Kira alone has understood that this land is not simply property to be inherited, but a trust to be honored. She has earned this inheritance through her devotion, her sacrifice, and her deep understanding of what it means to be a true steward of the Widsin legacy. Nora was the first to find her voice. There must be some mistake. Grandfather wouldn't have left everything to one person. What about the rest of the family? What about his children? Melinda looked at her steadily. There is no mistake. Mr. Widsin was very clear about his intentions. The will goes on to explain his reasoning. She returned to the document. My children and grandchildren have chosen to build their lives away from this place, which is their right. But they cannot claim inheritance rights to a legacy they have not participated in maintaining. Kira alone has lived this legacy daily. She alone has sacrificed personal ambitions to preserve what our family has built here. Therefore, she alone has earned the right to determine its future. Ellen's husband, Dr. Peterson, leaned forward. Surely there are provisions for the other family members. Some division of assets, I'm afraid not, Melinda replied. The will does include smaller bequests personal items with sentimental value distributed among various family members. But the primary estate, including the land and house, goes entirely to Kira. I felt detached from my own body, as if I were floating somewhere near the ceiling watching this scene unfold below. The magnitude of what was happening was too large to process. For 43 years, I'd lived in that house as a caretaker, never imagining I might someday own it. The responsibility felt overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Craig, the lawyer, was asking Melinda about the possibility of contesting the will. She explained that grandfather had been thoroughly evaluated for mental competency before signing the document, and that she had extensive notes documenting his reasoning and intentions. The will was ironclad. Tessa was staring at me with unconcealed amazement. "Aunt Kira," she said, using a title that felt strange coming from her we'd barely spoken in years. "Did you know about this? Did grandfather tell you what he was planning?" I shook my head, finding my voice for the first time since the reading began. I had no idea. He never said anything about changing his will. But even as I spoke, I remembered things that suddenly took on new significance. The way grandfather had insisted on showing me the property boundaries last fall, walking the entire perimeter despite his failing health. The questions he'd asked about my plans for the future, whether I'd ever thought about leaving Vermont, what I hoped to accomplish with my life. The long conversations we'd had about farming practices and land conservation, during which he'd listened to my ideas with an intensity that had surprised me. Marcus was speaking now, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is completely unfair. Kira, you have to understand that this puts the entire family in an impossible position. That land has been in our family for 5 generations. It belongs to all of us, not just to one person. Actually," Melinda interjected firmly, "it now belongs legally and completely to Kira. The will is binding and enforceable. But morally," Ellen added, her voice rising slightly, Surely Kira understands that the family should make these decisions together. The farm is our heritage too. I felt all eyes turning toward me, waiting for my response. The weight of their expectation was familiar. This was how it had always been. Kira would be reasonable. Kira would accommodate everyone else's needs. Kira would put family harmony above her own interests. They were waiting for me to say that of course we'd work something out, that I'd never dream of keeping the entire inheritance for myself. Instead, I found myself thinking about the 43 years I'd spent maintaining that heritage while they built lives elsewhere. I thought about the Christmas celebrations I'd missed because someone had to stay with grandfather, the relationships I'd never pursued because the farm required my constant attention, the dreams I'd set aside because family duty came first. I need time to think about all of this, I said finally. This is a lot to process. Of course, Joel said gently. He was the only one who looked at me with something approaching sympathy. This must be overwhelming for you too, but I could see the calculation happening behind the other's eyes. They were already strategizing, already planning their next moves. The reading concluded with the distribution of personal bequests: grandfather's pocket watch to Marcus, his military medals to Craig, his wedding ring to Ellen, his collection of farming journals to Joel, small tokens that acknowledged their connection to him while making it clear where his primary loyalty lay. As we filed out of the conference room, Nora caught my arm. Kira, we need to talk. All of us. This is too important to decide hastily. We're family, Marcus added, his tone suggesting that this should settle everything. We worked these things out together, but for the first time in my life, I looked at these people, my blood relatives, my childhood companions, my father's nephews and nieces, and I didn't feel like family. I felt like someone who'd been invisible for so long that they'd forgotten I existed, until suddenly I owned something they wanted. I drove home alone through the melting snow, the legal documents Melinda had given me sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. The farmhouse looked different somehow as I pulled into the familiar driveway. It was still the same weathered, clapboard structure with its green shutters and wraparound porch, but now it was mine. The responsibility of that ownership settled around my shoulders like a heavy coat. Inside, the house felt both empty and full, empty of grandfather's presence, but full of possibility. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, where I'd eaten breakfast nearly every morning for 76 years. Through the window, I could see the fields stretching toward the tree line, the sugar maples beginning to show the faintest hint of green, the barn where 5 generations of Widsins had stored hay and sheltered livestock. Mine now. All of it mine. The phone started ringing around dinner time, and it didn't stop for hours. The phone calls started that very evening and continued for days. First came Marcus, his voice carefully controlled as he suggested we meet to discuss the situation like reasonable adults. Then Ellen, who wanted to know if I'd considered the tax implications of inheriting such a large estate. Craig called with questions about estate planning and asset management, speaking to me in the same tone he might use with a child who'd accidentally broken something valuable. Nora's approach was different. She arrived unannounced on Saturday morning, carrying a bouquet of flowers from the expensive florist in St. Johnsbury, and wearing the kind of warm smile I hadn't seen from her in years. "Aunt Kira," she said, embracing me with surprising warmth. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I've been thinking about you constantly since Thursday." This must be such an emotional time. I invited her in, more out of ingrained politeness than genuine welcome. She settled herself at the kitchen table as if she'd been visiting regularly for years, commenting on how wonderful the house looked and how well I'd maintained everything. Her eyes, however, were cataloguing details with professional efficiency: the original wide-board floors, the restored farmhouse sink, the hand-hewn ceiling beams that gave the kitchen its rustic charm. I've been researching the property values in this area, she said, accepting the coffee I offered. Kira, do you realize what an incredible asset you've inherited? Prime farmland this close to ski areas and tourist destinations is worth a fortune. You could be sitting on millions of dollars. I sipped my coffee and waited for the real purpose of her visit to emerge. Nora had never shown much interest in the farm's monetary value when she thought it would be divided among the entire family. The thing is, she continued, leaning forward with enthusiasm, I've been developing some exciting ideas about how we could honor grandfather's legacy while also creating something really special here. Have you ever considered the potential for agritourism, farm-to-table experiences, wellness retreats? She pulled out her phone and began showing me photos of similar properties that had been converted into luxury destination venues. Beautiful rustic buildings, perfectly staged farm settings, promotional materials featuring well-dressed visitors enjoying curated countryside experiences. Imagine, she said, her voice taking on the practiced enthusiasm of a sales presentation. Keeping the farming operation, but adding complementary businesses that would generate substantial revenue. Wedding venues, corporate retreats, seasonal festivals. We could create a brand around the Widsins name and the 5-generation history. The more she talked, the clearer her vision became. She saw the farmhouse renovated into a boutique inn, the barn converted into an event space, the fields transformed into picturesque backdrops for photo opportunities. She spoke passionately about market research and business plans and partnership opportunities. But I noticed she never mentioned the actual farming that had been the heart of this place for over a century. Of course, she added, this kind of development would require significant capital investment and professional expertise. That's where I could help. My company specializes in heritage property development. We know how to preserve the authentic character while creating modern amenities that today's visitors expect. I set down my coffee cup and looked at her directly. Nora, are you proposing to buy the farm from me? She had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Well, not exactly buy, more like a family partnership. You'd retain ownership, of course, but my company would handle the development and management. We'd be honoring grandfather's legacy while creating a sustainable business model for future generations. Future generations of whom? I asked. The family, she said, as if this were obvious. Your legacy too, Aunt Kira. This could be your chance to create something lasting that benefits everyone. After she left, I walked through the house trying to see it through her eyes. The old floorboards that creaked in familiar patterns became original wideboard, pine flooring with authentic character. The stone fireplace, where 5 generations of Widsins had gathered on winter evenings, became a stunning focal point for luxury accommodations. The view from the parlor window, which showed our fields and the mountains beyond, became premium rural vistas perfect for destination weddings. It was still my house, but somehow Nora's visit had made it feel different. Her enthusiastic descriptions had overlaid my memories with images of strangers walking through these rooms, paying for the privilege of experiencing a sanitized version of the life I'd lived here. That afternoon, I called Joel. Of all my relatives, he'd always been the kindest, and I hoped he might offer a perspective that didn't involve immediate monetization of grandfather's legacy. I was wondering when you'd call, he said warmly. Sarah and I've been talking about you constantly. How are you holding up? Joel taught history at the community college in Lyndonville, and he understood the weight of the past in ways that some of the others didn't. When I told him about Nora's visit, he was quiet for a long moment. She means well, he said finally. But I think she's missing the point of why grandfather left the farm to you. This wasn't about creating a business opportunity. It was about recognizing that you're the one who's actually lived the legacy instead of just inheriting it. His words brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I don't know what to do. Joel, suddenly everyone wants to be involved in decisions about this place, but for 40 years they barely acknowledged that I existed. That's exactly the problem, he said. Now that the farm has monetary value, everyone's an expert on what should happen to it. But none of them understand what it's meant to you or what you've meant to it. We talked for nearly an hour, and by the end of the conversation, I felt less alone. Joel remembered the farm from his perspective as a child visiting during summers, but he also understood that my relationship with this place was fundamentally different. I hadn't just visited here. I'd grown up here, worked here, sacrificed for here, and chosen to build my entire life around maintaining what previous generations had created. The next visitor was Tessa, who arrived in a rental car with New York plates and a carefully curated selection of vintage suitcases. She'd decided to stay in the area for a few weeks, she announced, to reconnect with her roots and help me navigate this transition. Tessa's approach was different from Nora's business proposition or Marcus's legal concerns. She saw everything through the lens of social media potential, and her enthusiasm was both amusing and exhausting. She wanted to document the authentic farm lifestyle, create content around family heritage and rural authenticity, and help me understand how to leverage the narrative of inheriting the family farm. "Aunt Kira, your story is incredible," she said, setting up her phone to photograph the sunset over our fields. Single woman inherits family farm at 76. It's like something from a movie. We could build a whole brand around this. Sustainable living, traditional farming, the wisdom of older women. You could become an influencer. I had to ask her to explain what an influencer was, which seemed to delight her even more. The idea that I might build a following of strangers entrusted in my daily life was so foreign that I couldn't quite grasp it. But Tessa was persistent, showing me examples of other people who'd built online audiences around farming, rural living, and family stories. "The key is authenticity," she explained, photographing me as I fed the chickens that had been laying eggs for our breakfast table for years. "People are hungry for real stories, real connections to the land. You've been living this authentic life for decades now, you just need to share it." But her version of authenticity felt performative in ways that made me uncomfortable. She wanted me to wear particular clothes for photos, to time certain activities for optimal lighting, to frame my interactions with the land in ways that would appeal to an audience I'd never met. When I collected eggs, I'd done it the same way. 4 years, efficiently, quietly, with attention to the hands' comfort and the quality of their laying boxes. Tessa wanted me to collect eggs thoughtfully, photogenically, with visible appreciation for the symbiotic relationship between farmer and livestock. The strangest part was how my relative's sudden attention made me question things I'd never doubted before. For 4 decades, I'd known who I was, the family member who stayed, who maintained the continuity, who sacrificed personal ambitions for the greater good of preserving what we'd inherited. But now their various agendas made me wonder if I'd been naive, if I'd missed opportunities, if my quiet life had been a waste of potential, lying in bed at night in the room where I'd slept. Since childhood, I found myself reviewing memories with new eyes. Had I chosen to stay on the farm, or had I simply defaulted into staying because it was easier than making other choices? Had my devotion to grandfather been genuine love, or had it been a way of avoiding the challenge of building an independent life? Had I preserved the family legacy, or had I hidden from the world? These questions felt disloyal to grandfather's memory and to my own life choices, but they persisted. When Marcus called to suggest a family meeting to discuss options, I agreed partly because I wanted to understand their perspectives and partly because I needed to articulate my own. The meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday at Joel and Sarah's house in Lyndonville, neutral territory, Joel explained, where everyone could speak freely without the emotional weight of being in the family farmhouse. I appreciated his thoughtfulness, but I also recognized the implicit message. Even discussions about my inheritance needed to happen somewhere other than my own home. As I prepared for that meeting, I spent time walking the property boundaries, something grandfather and I had done together regularly over the years. The land was coming alive with spring green shoots pushing through the soil, buds swelling on the maple trees, birds returning from their winter migrations. This was the cycle I'd participated in for 76 years, the rhythm that had shaped my life more than any human relationship. Standing in the upper pasture where you could see the entire valley spread out below, I tried to imagine Nora's vision of wedding parties posing against this backdrop, or Tessa's social media followers, experiencing curated versions of farm life, or Marcus's practical concerns about property taxes and asset management. None of these visions included the daily reality of farming, the early mornings and late nights, the constant attention to weather and seasons, the physical demands of maintaining buildings and equipment, the financial uncertainties that came with depending on the land for sustenance. But they also didn't include the deep satisfaction of this life, the connection to something larger than individual ambition, the privilege of being a steward for future generations I might never meet. Grandfather had understood this, and that's why he'd entrusted the farm to me, rather than to relatives who saw it as an asset to be managed, rather than a legacy to be lived out by the time Sunday arrived. I'd made a decision about what I wanted to say to the family, but I also knew that saying it would change our relationships forever. The family meeting took place in Joel and Sarah's comfortable living room, where everyone arranged themselves on sofas and chairs with coffee cups and nervous energy. Sarah had made her famous apple coffee cake, and the familiar smell reminded me of dozens of family gatherings over the years. But this felt different, formal, and charged with unspoken agendas. Marcus opened the discussion with what he called practical considerations. He'd consulted with financial advisors about the tax implications of inheriting such a large estate. Without proper planning, he explained, the property taxes alone could force me to sell within a few years. He'd also researched options for establishing family trusts that would protect the land, while allowing for shared decision-making. The goal, he said, consulting notes he'd made on a legal pad, is to preserve what Dad built, while ensuring the family remains connected to this legacy. Kira, you've carried the burden alone for too long. Now we need to work together to secure the future. Ellen presented her own research into conservation easements and agricultural preservation programs. Her husband, Dr. Peterson, had connections with environmental organizations that specialized in protecting working farmland. They could help establish legal protections that would prevent development while providing tax benefits that would make ownership sustainable. The important thing, Ellen emphasized, is that we move carefully and thoughtfully. This isn't just about one person's preferences. It's about preserving a legacy that belongs to all of us. Nora had prepared a formal presentation using her laptop and a small projector she'd brought. Her slides showed market analysis, revenue projections, and architectural renderings of how the property could be developed while maintaining its agricultural character. She'd researched similar properties throughout New England and created a comprehensive business plan for what she called Widsins Heritage Farm. The beauty of this approach, she explained, clicking through images of converted barns and restored farmhouses, is that we'd be creating multiple revenue streams while actually enhancing the property's value. Agritourism brings in consistent income. Special events generate substantial one-time fees, and the farm-to-table component creates ongoing relationships with restaurants and specialty food stores. Craig, the lawyer, had prepared a detailed analysis of ownership structures that would allow for family participation while protecting everyone's interests. He recommended forming a limited liability company with me as the managing partner, but with other family members as investors and advisors. Tessa's contribution was a social media strategy that would build awareness and attract visitors to whatever we decided to do with the property. She'd already created placeholder accounts on various platforms and had begun following other rural influencers to understand what content performed well with target audiences. The key, she said, showing us charts of engagement, metrics, and demographic breakdowns, is building an authentic brand that attracts people who value heritage and sustainability. And Kira's story is perfect for this market. She's the real thing, not someone playing at farm life for the cameras. As each family member presented their vision, I felt increasingly like a character in someone else's story. They spoke about me as if I were an asset to be managed, a symbol to be marketed, or a problem to be solved. Even their kindest suggestions carried the assumption that I couldn't or shouldn't make decisions about the farm's future on my own. When they finished their presentations, Joel asked if I wanted to respond. The room fell quiet, and I could feel everyone waiting for me to express gratitude for their concern and enthusiasm for their collaborative approach. Instead, I told them about my conversation with Lyle Brennan. Lyle lived on the adjacent property, a modest farmhouse he'd bought 5 years earlier after his wife died. We'd become friends gradually, sharing conversations over the fence line between our properties and occasionally helping each other with seasonal tasks. He was one of the few people who understood my attachment to this place without needing explanations or justifications. 2 days after Nora's visit, I'd walked over to his place, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden attention from family members who'd barely acknowledged my existence for years. Lyle was working in his garden, preparing beds for spring planting, and he listened without interruption while I described the various proposals and suggestions that had been thrust upon me. "Sounds like they all think you've been playing house for 40 years instead of living a real life," he said when I finished. "Now that there's money involved, they want to rescue you from your own choices." His bluntness was refreshing after days of carefully diplomatic language from my relatives. "But maybe they're right," I said. "Maybe I've been hiding from the world instead of engaging with it." Lyle straightened up from his garden and looked at me directly. "Kira, do you know what this valley looked like when I moved here? Half the farms were abandoned, fields growing up to scrub, old farmhouses falling down because nobody wanted to maintain them. Your place was different, clean, productive, obviously loved. That didn't happen by accident." He gestured toward my property, visible across the stone wall that separated our land. "What you've done here isn't hiding from the world, it's creating a world worth preserving. There's a difference between choosing a quiet life and defaulting into one." As I told my family about this conversation, I watched their faces register surprise and something that might have been condescension. The idea that my neighbour's opinion carried weight with me seemed to puzzle them, as if my relationships outside the family were less significant than their collective wisdom. "Lyle sounds like a nice man," Ellen said carefully, "but this is really a family matter. We appreciate your friendship with him, but decisions about the farm should involve people who've been connected to this place for generations." "Actually," I said, "Lyle understands this place better than most of you do. He chooses to live here, not because he inherited property or sees business opportunities, but because he values what rural life offers." That's something I can relate to. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on the patient tone he might use with someone who wasn't thinking clearly. "Kira, we're not questioning your judgment or your relationship with your neighbour. We're trying to help you understand the responsibilities that come with inheriting property of this magnitude. This isn't just about your personal preferences anymore." "But that's exactly what it is about," I replied, feeling my voice grow stronger. "For 40 years, this has been about everyone else's preferences about what the family needed, what grandfather required, what would preserve harmony and continuity. I've spent my entire adult life making decisions based on other people's expectations and needs. Nora shifted uncomfortably, but Aunt Kira, we're family. We should make these decisions together. We are? I asked. When was the last time any of you visited the farm before grandfather died? When was the last time anyone called to ask how I was doing, not because you needed something, but just to maintain a relationship? The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Joel looked down at his hands, and Sarah busied herself refilling coffee cups. Tessa scrolled through her phone, apparently searching for something important. That's not fair, Marcus said finally. We all have busy lives, responsibilities in different places. We assumed you were content with your choices. You assumed I didn't matter, I said. You assumed that because I stayed and took care of things, I didn't have feelings or ambitions or the right to make decisions about my own life. Now that I own something valuable, suddenly I'm worth paying attention to. Craig, the lawyer, cleared his throat. Kira, I think there's been a misunderstanding. No one is questioning your right to make decisions about the property. We're offering to help you make informed decisions that benefit everyone. Benefit everyone, I repeated. Including me, or am I just the caretaker again, managing assets for the good of the larger family? Ellen's voice rose slightly. That's a terrible thing to say. We care about you. Kira, we're trying to help you avoid making decisions you might regret later. Like what decisions? I asked. Like choosing to maintain the farm as a working agricultural operation instead of converting it into a tourist attraction. Like preferring to live quietly instead of becoming a social media personality. Like valuing the relationships I've built here instead of prioritizing family members who've ignored me for years. Tessa looked up from her phone. Aunt Kira, nobody's trying to force you into anything. We just think you might be underestimating the opportunities this inheritance represents, and I think you're underestimating what this inheritance means to me, I replied. This isn't an opportunity that fell into my lap. It's the culmination of a lifetime of commitment. Grandfather didn't leave me this property because he felt sorry for me. He left it to me because I earned it. The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different, charged with recognition of something that had been unspoken for decades. My relatives were beginning to understand that their forgotten aunt had opinions, boundaries, and the legal right to enforce both. Joel was the first to speak. You're right, he said quietly. We have been taking you for granted. I'm sorry about that. Sarah nodded in agreement. We should have done better at staying in touch, at including you in family activities. That wasn't fair, but Marcus wasn't ready to concede the larger point. Even if we haven't been as attentive as we should have been, this is still bigger than individual feelings. The farm represents 5 generations of family history. That creates responsibilities that go beyond personal preferences. To whom? I asked. To ancestors who are dead. To family members who moved away and built lives elsewhere. To some abstract idea of continuity that nobody actually lived except me. Nora made one more attempt to redirect the conversation toward collaboration. Kira, what if we approach this differently? What if you told us what you want to do with the property, and we figured out how to support your vision instead of imposing our own ideas? It was a reasonable question, and I'd been thinking about the answer since grandfather's death. But my vision was so different from their assumptions that I wasn't sure they'd understand it. I want to keep farming, I said simply. I want to maintain the house and barns, grow crops, keep livestock, and continue the agricultural tradition that's sustained this place for over a century. I want to live quietly, make decisions based on what's good for the land, and build relationships with people who understand why that matters. That's beautiful, Tessa said, but how do you plan to fund those activities? Farming isn't profitable anymore, especially small-scale operations like this. Then I'll figure out how to make it profitable, I said. Or I'll live simply enough that profitability isn't the primary concern. But I won't turn this place into entertainment for people who want to play at being farmers for a weekend. The meeting ended with polite but strained goodbyes and promises to continue the conversation later. But as I drove home through the familiar landscape of stone walls and rolling fields, I knew the real conversation was over. I'd finally spoken the truth that had been building inside me for years. I was tired of being invisible, tired of being taken for granted, and tired of prioritizing other people's comfort over my own integrity. The farm was mine now, and I intended to keep it. 3 weeks after the family meeting, I was cleaning out grandfather's desk when I discovered the letters. I'd been putting off this task, partly because going through his personal belongings felt intrusive, and partly because I wasn't ready to face the finality of disposing of his things. But spring was advancing, and I needed to prepare for the planting season, which meant clearing space in his study for seed catalogues and farm records. The desk was a massive oak piece that had belonged to his father, built with the kind of solid craftsmanship that was meant to last generations. Its drawers were deep and filled with decades of accumulated papers, tax records, equipment warranties, subscription renewals for farming magazines, and correspondence with agricultural extension services. I'd been working through these methodically, saving what seemed important and discarding what was clearly outdated. The locked drawer was hidden behind a false front that I discovered accidentally when one of the visible drawers stuck, and I was trying to force it open. My pressure on the wrong spot triggered a small latch, and suddenly I was looking at a narrow compartment I'd never known existed. Inside were 2 manila envelopes, each labelled in grandfather's careful handwriting, family matters and legal correspondence. I almost didn't open them. Grandfather had been a private man, and if he'd wanted me to know about these documents, he would have told me about them before he died. But my name was written on both envelopes, along with a note, for Kira. When the time comes to understand, the legal correspondence folder contained copies of letters between grandfather and Melinda dating back almost 10 years. The earliest letters dealt with routine estate planning, but as I read chronologically, a different story emerged. Grandfather had been watching the family dynamics much more closely than any of us had realized, and his observations were both perceptive and troubling. In a letter dated 3 years earlier, he'd written to Melinda, "I'm increasingly concerned about how the family treats Kira. At last week's gathering, I watched my granddaughter serve dinner to 12 people, clean up afterward, and help my elderly sister to her car, all while the others socialized among themselves. When Ellen thanked her, it was with the same tone she might use with hired help. This is not how families should behave." Another letter, from 2 years ago, was more direct. Marcus called yesterday to ask about selling the back 40 acres to fund improvements to his vacation house in Stowe. When I told him the land wasn't for sale, he suggested that Kira wouldn't know what to do with so much property anyway, and that the family should make these decisions collectively. He seemed genuinely surprised when I reminded him that Kira has been managing this property for decades and understands it better than anyone. But the most revealing letter was dated just 8 months before grandfather's death. In it, he described a conversation with Craig about tax planning strategies. Craig recommended putting the property into a family trust with multiple beneficiaries to minimize estate taxes. When I asked him who he thought should manage the trust, he said they could hire a property management company and Kira could stay on as a caretaker if she wanted. A caretaker in her own home. This confirmed what I've suspected for years. They see her as convenient help, not as a family member with equal rights and dignity. The Family Matters folder was even more illuminating. It contained copies of letters grandfather had written to various family members over the years, along with their responses. Most of his letters were gentle inquiries about visiting the farm, maintaining family connections, or including Kira in gatherings. The responses were polite, but revealing in their casual dismissal of these suggestions. Marcus had written, "Dad, you know how much we all appreciate what Kira does for you and the property. But she seems perfectly content with her quiet life. I'm not sure she'd enjoy the chaos of our family reunions anyway." Ellen's response to an invitation for Christmas dinner was more direct. "We'd love to have everyone, but honestly, our place isn't set up for someone who's not comfortable in social situations." "Kira always seems happier staying home anyway," Nora had written. "I think it's sweet that you want to include Aunt Kira more, but she's never shown much interest in what the rest of us are doing. We shouldn't force someone into social situations where they'll feel out of place." The most painful letter was from Craig's wife, responding to grandfather's suggestion that they visit the farm during their vacation in Vermont. "We appreciate the invitation, but we're looking for a more relaxing experience. The farm is beautiful, but there's not much for the kids to do there. And honestly, Kira isn't really good with children. We've found a lovely resort in Stowe that has activities for all ages." Each letter was a small rejection wrapped in considerate language, and together they painted a picture of a family that had systematically excluded one of its members while convincing themselves they were being kind. Worse, they convinced themselves that I preferred the isolation, that my quiet nature indicated contentment with being overlooked. But grandfather's letters showed he'd understood the truth. In his final letter to Melinda, dated just 2 months before his death, he'd written, "Kira has sacrificed 40 years of her life for this family and this land. She chose to stay when others chose to leave, and she has carried the burden of preservation alone while others built lives elsewhere. Yet when I observe family interactions, I see that her contributions are taken for granted and her preferences are assumed rather than asked about. This is not acceptable." The letter continued, "I've watched her become increasingly isolated from the family not by her choice, but by their indifference. They include her when they need something and ignore her when they don't. They speak about her as if she is not fully capable of independent thought or adult decisions. They treat her like a faithful family retainer rather than a woman who has earned respect through decades of service and sacrifice." The final paragraph was the most revealing. "I am changing my will not as a punishment to my other heirs, but as recognition of who has actually lived our family's values. Kira alone has understood that heritage is maintained through daily commitment, not inherited through accident of birth. She alone has earned the right to determine this property's future because she alone has shaped its present, sitting in grandfather's chair." With these letters spread across his desk, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because his observations confirmed what I'd always sensed, but had never articulated, that I'd been relegated to the margins of my own family despite being the one who maintained its most tangible connection to the past. Sadness because grandfather had seen this happening and had felt compelled to document it, as if he'd needed evidence to justify his eventual decision. But there was something else in the letters that I hadn't expected. Anger on my behalf. Grandfather's typically restrained prose couldn't quite conceal his frustration with his children and grandchildren for their treatment of me. He'd tried repeatedly to encourage them to include me more fully in family activities, and their polite refusals had obviously influenced his decision about the inheritance. The most surprising discovery was a draft letter he'd apparently written, but never sent, addressed to all of his children and grandchildren. It was dated 6 months before his death, and marked "Never mailed too harsh." At the top, the draft read, "I am writing to express my disappointment in how this family has treated Kira over the years. While she has devoted her life to maintaining our legacy, you have pursued your own interests elsewhere, which is your right. But it is not your right to take her contributions for granted or to treat her as if she were hired help rather than Family, your assumption that she prefers isolation is convenient for you, but unfair to her. Your assumption that she lacks opinions about the family's future is insulting to someone who has invested more in that future than anyone else. The letter went on. I have observed family gatherings where Kira serves meals, cleans up, helps elderly relatives, and manages logistics while others socialize and take photos. I have watched you make plans for family events while assuming she won't want to participate. I've heard you discuss the farm's future as if she weren't qualified to have opinions about a place she's maintained for decades. This behavior is unacceptable, and it will have consequences. He'd never sent the letter, probably because he decided that actions would be more effective than words. But reading it helped me understand that the inheritance wasn't just about rewarding my loyalty, it was also about correcting an injustice that had been building for decades. The phone rang while I was still processing these revelations. It was Melinda Tran, calling with news that would complicate everything even further. Kira, she said, I wanted to give you advance notice about something. Craig has filed a motion to contest the will. He's claiming that your grandfather was unduly influenced by his isolation and declining health, and that the inheritance should be distributed according to Vermont's standard estate laws. I sat down heavily in grandfather's chair, the letters still scattered across the desk. What does that mean exactly? It means there will be a court hearing where they'll try to prove that the will doesn't reflect your grandfather's true intentions, Melinda explained. They'll argue that he was manipulated or coerced into leaving everything to you, or that he wasn't mentally competent when he signed the will. But you said the will was ironclad. You said he was evaluated for mental competency. He was, and the will is solid, Melinda assured me. But anyone can file a contest, and the court has to hear the arguments. It doesn't mean they'll succeed, but it does mean this process will take longer and become more expensive than we originally expected. After hanging up, I sat in grandfather's study as the afternoon light slanted through the windows and illuminated the letters that revealed so much about my family's true feelings. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were claiming grandfather had been unduly influenced by me, when his own words showed that his decision had been influenced by their decades of indifference toward me. But I also realized that this legal challenge might be a blessing in disguise. If these letters became part of the court record, the family would have to confront grandfather's documented observations about their treatment of me. They would have to explain why someone they claimed to care about had been systematically excluded from family activities and decision-making for years. More importantly, I would finally have an opportunity to tell my side of the story in a forum where my voice would carry legal weight. For 40 years, I'd absorbed their assumptions about my preferences and capabilities without challenging them. Now I would have a chance to speak for myself about what this inheritance meant and why I'd earned it. As evening approached, I carefully organized grandfather's letters and put them in a safe place. Tomorrow I would call Melinda and arrange to share these documents with her. But tonight, I wanted to walk the property lines one more time and think about what I was willing to fight. For Doc, the family thought they were contesting a will. But what they were really challenging was my right to be seen as a full human being with legitimate claims to respect, recognition, and self-determination. And that was a fight I was finally ready to have. The court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early May, when the sugar maples were fully leafed out and the farm was coming alive with the energy of spring planting. I'd spent the previous weeks working with Melinda to prepare our response to the family's challenge, and the process had forced me to articulate things about my life that I'd never put into words before. The legal arguments were complex, but the fundamental question was simple. Had grandfather been competent and free from undue influence when he decided to leave everything to me? Craig's legal team was arguing that my position as living caretaker had given me inappropriate influence over an elderly man whose judgment was compromised by isolation and declining health. They painted a picture of manipulation, of a lonely, old man being convinced to favour the person who controlled his daily environment. Melinda's counter-strategy focused on documentation. We had medical records showing grandfather's mental acuity right up until his death, his own letters describing his reasoning for the inheritance decision, and decades of evidence showing my genuine commitment to the farm and his care. But we also had something more powerful, grandfather's own words about how the family had treated me over the years. The week before the hearing, I received an unexpected visit from Joel. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, looking troubled and carrying a manila folder of his own. "Kira, we need to talk," he said, settling into the familiar spot at the kitchen table. "There are things happening that you should know about." He opened his folder and showed me copies of documents that Craig had prepared for the court case. The family's legal strategy was more aggressive than I'd realized. They weren't just questioning grandfather's mental competency, they were questioning mine. Craig's filing included statements suggesting that I'd become increasingly isolated and possibly unstable over the years, that my lack of relationships outside the farm indicated an unhealthy attachment to the property, and that my sudden resistance to family involvement in decision-making showed signs of paranoid thinking. They were portraying me not as someone who'd earned an inheritance through decades of service, but as someone whose mental state made me unsuitable to manage such a valuable estate. "This is character assassination," Joel said, his voice tight with anger. "They're trying to paint you as some kind of recluse who manipulated a vulnerable old man. It's disgusting." The documents included statements from various family members about my antisocial tendencies and lack of engagement with the outside world. Marcus had provided an affidavit describing my increasing withdrawal from family activities and suggesting that my attachment to the farm had become obsessive and unhealthy. Ellen had contributed observations about my inability to maintain normal social relationships and my excessive dependence on grandfather for emotional support. Most painful was Nora's statement, which described my reaction to their development proposals as irrationally hostile and suggested that I was unable to think clearly about practical solutions to the challenges of property ownership. She'd characterized my desire to continue farming as evidence of unrealistic thinking and disconnection from contemporary economic realities. "The worst part," Joel continued, "is that they actually believe some of this. They've convinced themselves that your choice to live quietly is evidence of psychological problems rather than legitimate lifestyle preferences." I set down the documents and looked out the window toward the fields where I'd been planning to plant corn. The corn ground needed to be prepared soon if the crop was going to have enough growing season. But suddenly, the entire future of the farm felt uncertain again. "What do you think will happen at the hearing?" I asked. Joel leaned back in his chair. "Honestly, I think they're going to lose. Melinda has built a strong case, and these personal attacks on you might backfire. But the process is going to be ugly, and some of the things said in court will be hard to forget afterward." He was right about the ugliness. Over the following days, I received calls from Marcus and Ellen trying to convince me to settle out of court. Their approach was a mixture of concern for my well-being and veiled threats about what the hearing might reveal. "Kira, this whole process is going to be painful for everyone," Marcus said during one particularly difficult conversation. "Why don't we find a compromise that protects your interests while acknowledging the family's connection to the property? No one wants to go through a public hearing that drags out all these private family matters." Ellen was more direct. "You have to understand that Craig's lawyers are going to ask you very personal questions about your life choices, your relationships, your mental health. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny? Wouldn't it be easier to work out an agreement privately?" But I'd spent too many years accommodating their preferences to back down now. The hearing would give me an opportunity to speak publicly about my life and choices, to defend decisions that had never needed defending before, and to challenge assumptions that had shaped how the family saw me for decades. The weekend before the hearing, Lowell Brennan stopped by with an offer that surprised me. "I know this isn't my business," he said, "but I'd like to testify on your behalf if it would help. I've watched how you manage this place, how you interact with neighbors, how you've handled Harlan's care over the years. If they're going to question your competency, I want them to hear from someone who's seen you in action." His offer meant more to me than I could express. Lyle had no obligation to involve himself in my family's legal dispute, but he was willing to stand up for me in a way that none of my blood relatives had been. "What would you tell them?" I asked. "The truth," he said simply. "That you're one of the most capable people I've ever met. That you've maintained this property at a level that would impress any agricultural inspector. That you've cared for an elderly relative with patience and competence. That you've made thoughtful decisions about everything from crop rotation to equipment, maintenance to environmental conservation." He paused, looking across the fields that were showing the first green shoots of spring planting. "Most importantly, I'd tell them that choosing to live quietly doesn't mean choosing to live incompetently. Some of us prefer depth to breadth, quality to quantity. There's nothing wrong with building a meaningful life around the things you care about most." Melinda was enthusiastic about Lyle's offer to testify. "We need character witnesses who can speak to your daily competence and decision-making abilities," she explained. "Family members are too invested in the outcome to be credible witnesses, but a neighbour who's observed you over several years carries more weight." The night before the hearing, I sat in Grandfather's study reading through his final farm journal entries. I'd discovered the journal among his papers and had been saving it for when I felt strong enough to handle his last thoughts. The entries covered the final months of his life, when he knew his health was failing, but was still making plans for the farm's future. The entry dated 3 days before his death was the most revealing. "Kira has been working on next year's crop rotation plan, and her thinking is sophisticated in ways that would surprise the family. She understands soil science, water management, and sustainable agriculture practices better than anyone I've known. But more than that, she understands this place, its rhythms, its needs, its potential. When she talks about the farm's future, she speaks with knowledge earned through decades of attention and care. The family sees her quiet nature as evidence of limitation, but I see it as evidence of depth. She doesn't need to announce her competence because she lives it daily. She doesn't need external validation because she has internal confidence built on genuine expertise. They mistake her humility for weakness, her contentment for lack of ambition. They are wrong on all counts. I am leaving her this property not because I feel sorry for her, but because she has already proven herself its best possible steward. The inheritance will give her the legal authority to match the practical knowledge she has always possessed. I only regret that it has taken so long for her contributions to be properly recognized." Reading those words felt like receiving a final blessing from someone who truly understood my life choices when others had questioned them. Grandfather had seen past the family's assumptions to recognize the substance of who I'd become during my years on the farm. That night, I called Joel to thank him for his support throughout the process. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I should have spoken up years ago when I saw how the family was treating you. Maybe if I'd been more honest about what I observed, this whole situation could have been avoided." "What do you mean?" I watched them exclude you from family events and convince themselves that you preferred the isolation. I watched them make decisions about family gatherings without consulting you, then tell themselves that you wouldn't have been interested anyway. I knew it wasn't right, but I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." His honesty was painful, but also validating. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because it was easier not to," he admitted. "Because challenging the family dynamic would have made gatherings uncomfortable, and I valued family harmony more than family justice. I'm ashamed of that now. We talked for nearly an hour about family dynamics, about the difference between keeping peace and enabling injustice, about how easy it was to rationalize away small cruelties when addressing them would require courage. Joel's willingness to examine his own role in the family's treatment of me was the first real acknowledgement I'd received that their behavior had been problematic. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said before we hung up, I want you to know that you've earned every acre of that inheritance. And I'll make sure the rest of the family understands that, regardless of what the court decides. As I prepared for bed in the room where I'd slept for 76 years, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed since grandfather's death 2 months earlier. I'd gone from being the invisible family member to being the center of a legal dispute that would determine not just the ownership of the farm, but the validity of the life I'd chosen to live here. Tomorrow, in a courtroom full of strangers, I would have to defend decisions that had never felt like they needed defending. I would have to articulate the value of a quiet life lived in service to something larger than individual ambition. I would have to explain why choosing depth over breadth, commitment over mobility, and stewardship over profit represented not limitation but wisdom. But I was ready. For the first time in my life, I was prepared to speak for myself without worrying about family harmony or other people's comfort. The inheritance had given me more than property. It had given me the recognition that my choices mattered, my voice had value, and my life had been lived with purpose and dignity. Whatever the court decided, I would no longer be invisible. The Caledonia County Courthouse was a solid brick building that had presided over local legal matters for over a century. As I walked up its granite steps on that Tuesday morning in May, I felt the weight of history, not just my family's history, but the broader history of property disputes, inheritance conflicts, and questions about who has the right to determine their own destiny. The courtroom itself was smaller than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and tall windows that let in the spring morning light. Judge Margaret Thornton presided from an elevated bench, her grey hair pulled back in a simple bun, and her manner suggesting someone who had heard every possible variation of family conflict over her decades on the bench. Melinda had prepared me for the formal procedures, but experiencing them was still surreal. My entire life was being reduced to legal arguments, testimony, and evidence presented to strangers who would decide whether I was competent to inherit property I'd maintained for 40 years. Craig's attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Robert Caldwell from a Burlington law firm, opened with what he called a straightforward case of undue influence. He painted a picture of an isolated elderly man whose declining health and limited social contact had made him susceptible to manipulation by his living caretaker. Your Honor, Caldwell argued, we will show that Harlan Widsins' final will represents a dramatic departure from his previously expressed intentions to distribute his estate among his children and grandchildren. This change occurred during a period when he was increasingly dependent on the defendant, both for physical care and social contact. The evidence will demonstrate that this dependency created an opportunity for undue influence that resulted in an inheritance that does not reflect Mr. Widsins' true wishes. He described my relationship with grandfather as unhealthily codependent, suggesting that my lack of independent social connections had made me manipulative in my caregiving role. He characterized my resistance to family involvement in farm decisions as evidence of possessive and controlling behavior that had isolated grandfather from his other relatives. The family's case relied heavily on testimony from Marcus, Ellen, and Nora, who each described their version of my relationship with grandfather and their concerns about my ability to manage such a valuable estate. Their testimony was carefully crafted to sound concerned rather than greedy, focusing on my alleged limitations rather than their own desire for inheritance. Marcus testified first, describing his father as a man who had always valued family unity and would never have intended to exclude his children and grandchildren from his legacy. He characterized my caregiving as having become increasingly controlling over grandfather's final years, limiting his contact with other family members and creating an environment where only Kira's opinions mattered. My father was a fair man who believed in treating his children equally, Marcus said. The will that was read doesn't reflect the values he taught us or the intentions he expressed to me personally over the years. I believe he was influenced to change his will during a period when his judgment was compromised by illness and isolation. Ellen's testimony focused on my alleged social isolation and what she characterized as concerning behavior around family events. She described my decision not to attend family reunions as evidence of increasing withdrawal from normal social interaction and suggested that my attachment to the farm had become obsessive and unhealthy. Kira has always been quiet, Ellen said, but in recent years her isolation became more pronounced. She seemed unable to engage in normal family conversations, and she showed increasing hostility toward any suggestions about the farm's future. We were concerned that her influence over my father was preventing him from maintaining connections with the rest of the family. Nora's testimony was the most damaging because it was delivered with apparent sympathy for my situation, she described. Visiting me after grandfather's death and being shocked by my reaction to her development proposals. I was trying to offer Aunt Kira options that would provide financial security while honouring the family heritage, Nora said. But she responded with what I can only describe as irrational hostility. She seemed unable to consider practical solutions or think clearly about the challenges of managing such a large property. It was obvious that she was overwhelmed and needed help making informed decisions. Listening to their testimony was like hearing my life described by strangers who had observed occasional moments but understood nothing about the daily reality of my choices. They spoke about me as if I were a character in a story they'd invented, rather than a real person whose motivations and capabilities they'd never bothered to understand. But the most difficult moment came when Caldwell called me to testify, cross-examination. By a hostile attorney is designed to be intimidating, and Caldwell was skilled at asking questions that made reasonable choices sound suspicious. Miss Widsin, he began, isn't it true that you never married or had children of your own? That's correct. And isn't it true that you never established a career outside the family farm? I worked on the farm, which is a career, but you never held employment that would have provided independence from your grandfather's support. I contributed to the farm's operation and received room and board in return. That's a common arrangement in family farming operations, Miss Widsin. Over the 40 years you lived with your grandfather, how many close personal relationships did you maintain outside the family? Melinda objected to the relevance of the question, but Judge Thornton allowed it. I found myself having to defend choices that had never felt like limitations before. I maintained friendships with neighbours, people from church, and others in the community. Can you name 3 people who would consider themselves close personal friends of yours? The question was designed to highlight my social isolation, but as I answered it, I realized how differently I define meaningful relationships than my interrogator did. Lyle Brennan, my neighbour. Margaret Flint, who runs the local historical society. Dr. Morrison, who's been our veterinarian for 20 years. These are people I've known for years and who understand my life here. Miss Widsin, didn't your isolation from normal social activities create an unhealthy dependence on your grandfather for emotional support? No, my relationship with my grandfather was based on mutual respect and shared commitment to maintaining this farm. I wasn't isolated, I was engaged with the work and community that mattered to me. Caldwell continued this line of questioning for nearly an hour, trying to make my contentment with rural life sound like evidence of mental instability. But as the questioning continued, I began to understand that he was revealing more about his assumptions than about my limitations. When Melinda began presenting our case, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. She started with medical records, documenting grandfather's mental acuity right up until his death, followed by testimony from Dr. Morrison about grandfather's engagement with farm planning decisions during his final months. Dr. Morrison, Melinda asked, in your professional opinion, was Mr. Widsin mentally competent during your final visits to the farm? Absolutely. He was asking detailed questions about herd health, planning for spring breeding, and discussing long-term pasture management strategies. Those aren't the concerns of someone whose judgment is compromised. But the most powerful evidence came from grandfather's own letters, which Melinda read into the court record. His documented observations about the family's treatment of me over the years, his detailed reasoning for the inheritance decision, and his clear articulation of my qualifications for managing the property created a compelling picture of a thoughtful man making deliberate choices based on decades of observation. When Melinda read grandfather's letter describing Marcus's suggestion that I could stay on as a caretaker after the property was put into a family trust, several family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge took notes as Melinda continued reading grandfather's documentation of their casual dismissal of my contributions and their assumptions about my preferences. Your Honor, Melinda said, these letters show that Mr. Widsin's decision wasn't influenced by Miss Widson's manipulation, but by his own careful observation of family dynamics over many years. He wasn't excluding his children and grandchildren from his legacy. He was recognizing that only one family member had actually participated in maintaining that legacy. Lyle's testimony provided external validation of my competence that the family couldn't challenge. He described my management of the farm operation, my knowledge of agricultural practices, and my thoughtful approach to decision-making about everything from equipment purchases to environmental conservation. Miss Widsin is one of the most knowledgeable farmers I've encountered, Lyle testified. Her understanding of soil management, sustainable agriculture, and land stewardship would impress any agricultural extension agent. She's not someone who needs supervision or guidance, she's someone other farmers consult for advice. Margaret Flint from the Historical Society testified about my involvement in community activities, describing my contributions to local historical preservation efforts and my knowledge of regional farming history. Dr. Morrison spoke about my competent management of grandfather's medical care and my thoughtful questions about his health needs. But the most compelling testimony came when Melinda called me back to the stand for direct examination. This time, instead of defending my choices, I was able to explain them. Miss Widsin, Melinda asked, can you tell the court why you chose to remain on the family farm instead of pursuing other opportunities? Because this work mattered to me more than other opportunities. I found meaning in maintaining something that previous generations had built, in preserving agricultural traditions, and in caring for land that had been in our family for over a century. Those aren't limitations, they're choices based on values. That guided my entire life. Did you ever feel that your grandfather was pressuring you to stay or manipulating you to provide care? Never. He made it clear that I was free to leave whenever I wanted, and he often encouraged me to pursue other interests if they appealed to me. I stayed because this life fulfilled me, not because I felt trapped by it. Miss Widsin, the plaintiffs, have suggested that your reluctance to accept their development proposals indicates an inability to think practically about the farm's future. How do you respond to that? I respond by saying that I've been thinking practically about this farm's future for 40 years. I understand crop rotation, soil conservation, equipment maintenance, financial planning, and sustainable agriculture practices. The proposals they offered would have eliminated the farming operation that has sustained this land for generations. That's not practical. It's profitable for developers, but it's not sustainable for the land or the community. What are your plans for the farm's future, to continue farming it? To maintain the buildings and infrastructure that previous generations built. To practice sustainable agriculture that preserves the soil for future generations. To be a good neighbour and community member. To honour the trust that my grandfather placed in me by proving worthy of his confidence. The final arguments took place in the late afternoon, as shadows were lengthening across the courthouse lawn. Caldwell made one last attempt to portray the inheritance as the result of manipulation by someone unsuited for such responsibility. But Melinda's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. Your Honour, the evidence shows that Harlan Whitson made a thoughtful decision based on decades of observation. He left his property to the person who had actually maintained it, cared for it, and demonstrated deep understanding of its needs. The plaintiffs want to inherit something they never participated in preserving. Miss Widsin inherited something she had already been managing successfully for 40 years. Judge Thornton retired to consider her decision, and we waited in the courthouse corridor for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. When she returned, her expression was unreadable. This case, she began, involves fundamental questions about the nature of family obligation, the meaning of inheritance, and the right of competent individuals to determine the disposition of their property. After reviewing all the evidence and testimony, I find no basis for the claims of undue influence or mental incompetency. She continued. Mr. Widson's letters demonstrate careful consideration of his decision over many years. His medical records show mental competency until his death. The testimony of multiple witnesses confirms Miss Widson's competence to manage agricultural property. Most importantly, the evidence shows that Mr. Widson's decision was based on his own observations and values, not on manipulation by the beneficiary. The relief I felt was so overwhelming that I had to grip the edge of the bench to steady myself. But Judge Thornton wasn't finished. This court notes that inheritance disputes often reveal underlying family dynamics that contributed to the contested decisions. The evidence suggests that Mr. Widson's will was intended not just to reward Miss Widson's devotion, but to correct what he perceived as decades of undervaluation of her contributions. While this court cannot resolve family relationships, it can and does uphold the legal right of competent individuals to dispose of their property according to their own judgment of who has earned such inheritance. She concluded, the motion to contest the will is denied. Miss Widson's inheritance is confirmed in its entirety. As we filed out of the courtroom, my family members avoided eye contact with me. They spoke quietly among themselves while Melinda gathered the legal documents that had validated my competence and my inheritance. But their avoidance felt different now, not like dismissal, but like embarrassment at having their assumptions about me exposed in such a public forum. Lyle waited for me outside the courthouse, and his smile was the first thing that had felt entirely positive all day. How does it feel to be officially competent? He asked. Exhausting, I said, but also liberating. I've never had to defend my life choices before. Now I know I can. As I drove home through the familiar landscape of rolling hills and spring farmland, I realized that the hearing had accomplished something beyond legal validation. For the first time in my life, I'd been forced to articulate the value and meaning of the choices I'd made, and in doing so, I discovered that my quiet life had been more purposeful and substantial than I'd ever recognized. The farm was mine, not just legally now, but emotionally. I'd fought for it and won. More importantly, I'd fought for myself and discovered that I was stronger than anyone, including me, had ever imagined. 1 year later, I stood in the same upper pasture where I'd walked during those turbulent weeks after grandfather's death. But everything felt different now. The legal battle was a memory. The family dynamics had settled into new patterns, and the farm was thriving under my full ownership in ways that vindicated every difficult decision I'd made. The most visible changes were practical ones I'd used part of grandfather's modest investment portfolio to upgrade the farm's infrastructure, new fencing, improved irrigation systems, and energy-efficient equipment that reduced both costs and environmental impact. The old barn had been restored with help from local contractors who understood historical preservation, and the house had received updates that improved its functionality while preserving its character. But the deeper changes were in how I saw myself and how others saw me. The court hearing had forced me to articulate the value of my life choices, and that articulation had given me a confidence I'd never possessed before. I no longer apologize for preferring depth to breadth, quality to quantity, or stewardship to profit. I discovered that defending my choices had made them stronger. The family relationships had evolved in ways I couldn't have predicted. Marcus and Ellen had maintained a polite distance after the hearing, sending Christmas cards and making brief phone calls on my birthday, but never visiting or acknowledging that their assumptions about me had been proven wrong. They seemed to prefer the version of reality where I'd somehow manipulated grandfather, rather than examining why he'd felt compelled to document their treatment of me so thoroughly. Craig had been the most bitter about losing the legal challenge. He'd sent me a letter after the hearing suggesting that I consider selling the property and distributing the proceeds among the family to heal the divisions this inheritance has created. I'd responded with a brief note thanking him for his concern and informing him that I intended to keep the farm in productive agricultural use for the remainder of my life, exactly as grandfather had hoped. Nora had made several attempts to rebuild our relationship, but her efforts felt calculated rather than genuine. She'd continued to present business proposals disguised as family reconciliation, suggesting ways we could move forward together that always seemed to involve converting the farm into commercial ventures. When I'd made it clear that my vision for the property's future didn't include development or tourism, her interest in maintaining contact had faded. The surprise had been Tessa, who'd initially approached the inheritance as content for her social media brand, but had gradually developed what seemed like genuine appreciation for the farm life she'd initially seen as performance material. She'd started visiting regularly, not to photograph my daily routines, but to learn about agricultural practices and rural traditions that she'd never understood before. I always thought farming was just a job that people did when they couldn't get better jobs, she told me during one of her visits. But watching you work with the land, seeing how much knowledge and skill it requires, understanding the long-term thinking involved, it's actually incredible. You're not just growing crops, you're maintaining an ecosystem. Tessa had used her social media skills to help me connect with farmers markets and specialty food stores interested in locally grown produce. She'd also helped me establish relationships with agricultural schools whose students visited the farm to see sustainable farming practices in action. Her generation's appreciation for environmental stewardship and authentic food production had created markets for what I'd been doing for decades without calling it trendy. But the most meaningful change in family relationships had come from Joel. The court hearing had forced him to confront his own role in the family dynamics that had marginalized me for so long, and his response had been to actively work to repair our relationship. He'd started visiting monthly, bringing Sarah and their teenage daughter Emma, who was fascinated by the farming operation and had asked to spend part of her summer vacation learning agricultural skills. Joel had also become my advocate within the broader family, challenging assumptions about my choices and defending my decisions when other relatives questioned them. I realized I'd been complicit in treating you as if you were less capable of making adult decisions, he told me during one of our long conversations. I told myself I was being kind by not challenging the family's assumptions about what you wanted, but actually I was being cowardly. It was easier to go along with everyone else's version of who you were than to see who you actually are. The relationships that had sustained me most during the difficult period after the inheritance were the ones I'd built with neighbours and community members who understood rural life from the inside. Lyle had become not just a friend, but a companion in the deepest sense, someone who shared my appreciation for the rhythms of farm life and the satisfaction of work connected to the land. Our relationship had developed slowly and naturally, without the drama or complications that seem to characterize romantic connections in movies or novels. We were both in our 70s, both widowed by circumstance if not by marriage, both committed to living quietly and purposefully in a place we loved. Romance at our age looked different than it might have in our younger years, more about companionship and shared values than passion and intensity. Lyle had helped me navigate the practical challenges of managing a larger agricultural operation than I'd handled when grandfather was alive. He'd also helped me see that my knowledge and experience had value beyond the boundaries of my own property. Together, we'd started hosting workshops for beginning farmers, sharing techniques for sustainable agriculture and small-scale food production that seemed to be gaining popularity among younger people seeking alternatives to industrial farming. The community connections had expanded in ways that surprised me. Margaret Flint had involved me in the Historical Society's Oral History Project, interviewing long-time residents about changes in local farming practices over the decades. Dr. Morrison had recommended me to Agricultural Extension Services as someone who could mentor farmers transitioning to sustainable practices. The local food cooperative had featured my produce and asked me to write articles about seasonal farming for their newsletter. These activities had given me a public voice for the first time in my life, and I discovered that I had things to say that people wanted to hear. My decades of quiet observation had given me perspectives on farming, community, and environmental stewardship that resonated with people concerned about sustainability and local food systems. The most unexpected development had been the letter I'd received from a woman named Catherine Morrison, no relation to Dr. Morrison, who'd read about my court case in the local newspaper and wanted to share her own story of inheriting family property under similar circumstances. Catherine was in her 60s, lived in southern Vermont, and had inherited her family's maple sugaring operation after caring for her elderly father for 15 years. Like me, she'd been overlooked by relatives who'd assumed the property would be divided among multiple heirs, and like me, she'd faced family pressure to sell or develop the land rather than continue its traditional use. Reading about your case made me realize I wasn't alone, she'd written. There are probably many of us women who chose to stay, to care for elderly relatives, to maintain family properties who get overlooked until inheritance becomes an issue. Then suddenly everyone has opinions about what we should do with lives. We've been living successfully for decades. Catherine's letter had led to a friendship that had enriched my understanding of my own experience. We discovered that our situations had common elements that went beyond individual family dynamics. Rural communities were full of women who chose in caregiving and stewardship over conventional career paths, and many of these women faced similar challenges when their life choices were suddenly subject to family or legal scrutiny. Through Catherine, I'd met other women whose stories echoed aspects of my own daughters who'd stayed to run family businesses, wives who'd maintained farms after husbands died, sisters who'd sacrificed personal ambitions to care for aging parents. These connections had helped me understand that my experience, while unique in its details, reflected broader patterns of how women's contributions to family and community sustainability were often undervalued until they became inconvenient for other people's plans. As I walked through the farm on this anniversary morning, checking on crops that were thriving under my management and thinking about the year that had transformed my life so completely, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with vindication or victory over my family's challenges. The satisfaction came from finally living authentically, without apology or explanation for choices that had always felt right to me. The corn was knee-high and growing strong in soil that I'd been improving for decades. The vegetable gardens were producing abundance that I shared with neighbors and sold at farmers' markets. The pastures were lush with grass that fed a small herd of cattle whose meat was sought after by restaurants committed to local sourcing. The sugar maples that had been tapped by 5 generations of Widsins were healthy and productive, promising sweet syrup for generations to come. But more than the agricultural success, I felt proud of the community I'd built around the farm. Tessa's visits had evolved into genuine apprenticeship. She was learning to manage social media marketing for local farms while developing real skills in sustainable agriculture. Joel's daughter Emma had spent the summer working alongside me and had decided to study agricultural science in college with plans to return to farming after graduation. Lyle and I had begun hosting seasonal gatherings for neighbors interested in traditional farming techniques, food preservation, and rural skills that were disappearing as older farmers retired without passing on their knowledge. These events had become popular enough that we'd had to limit attendance, and requests for similar programs had come from other communities throughout Vermont. The most meaningful validation had come from an unexpected source. The Vermont Land Trust had approached me about establishing a conservation easement that would permanently protect the farm from development, while allowing continued agricultural use. The easement would provide tax benefits that would make the property more affordable to maintain, while ensuring that future generations would inherit working farmland rather than development opportunity. What you've maintained here represents exactly the kind of agricultural heritage that Vermont is trying to preserve, the Land Trust representative had explained. Properties like this with healthy soil, sustainable practices, and strong community connections are the foundation of our rural economy and environmental health. Signing the conservation easement felt like the completion of something Grandfather had started when he chose to leave me the farm. He'd recognized that I understood stewardship in ways that went beyond individual ownership, and the easement formalized that understanding into legal protection that would outlast my own lifetime. As the afternoon sun slanted across the fields, where I'd worked for more than 7 decades, I found myself thinking about the difference between the life I'd lived and the life my family had expected me to live. They'd seen my quiet existence as limitation, my contentment as resignation, my commitment as inability to make other choices. But I'd seen my life as purposeful engagement with work that mattered, relationships that sustained me, and responsibilities that connected me to something larger than individual ambition. The inheritance had given me legal recognition of what I'd always known, that I'd earned my place here through decades of daily commitment, that my choices had created value that deserved respect, and that my vision for this land's future was grounded in knowledge and experience that couldn't be purchased or inherited. Only lived. The phone rang as I was finishing my evening chores, and caller ID showed Joel's number. His monthly check-in calls had become one of the reliable pleasures of my week. "How's the new tractor working out?" he asked, referring to the efficient, environmentally friendly equipment I'd purchased to replace Grandfather's aging machinery. "Like a dream," I said. "I can plow the back 40 in half the time it used to take, and the fuel efficiency is remarkable. Emma's been telling everyone at school about her summer on the farm," he said. "She's convinced half her class to consider agricultural programs in college." We talked for 20 minutes about farming, family, and the satisfaction of work that connected us to the land and community we'd chosen to call home. Before hanging up, Joel said something that captured what the past year had meant to me. "Kira, I want you to know that watching you claim your inheritance, not just the legal part, but the whole process of standing up for yourself and your choices, has changed how I think about family loyalty, Real loyalty means supporting people's authentic choices, not pushing them toward choices that make other people more comfortable. After we hung up, I sat on the porch where 5 generations of Widsins had watched the sun set over this valley. The fireflies were beginning their evening dance, and the air carried the sweet smell of hay and the promise of a productive harvest. Seasoned at 77 years old, I'd finally learned the difference between being invisible and being overlooked, between contentment and resignation, between choosing a quiet life and having a quiet life chosen for you. The inheritance had given me more than property. It had given me the recognition that my life had meaning, my choices had value, and my voice deserved to be heard. Tomorrow would bring the familiar rhythms of farm work, the satisfaction of tending something larger than myself, and the quiet pleasure of a life lived according to values that had sustained me through 7 decades of change. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do, in the place that had always been home. The farm was mine now, completely and permanently. But more importantly, I was finally, fully mine. As well. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.